Hello and welcome back to the fourth and final part of our donut modeling tutorial in Maya. So last we left off, we added a bunch of sprinkles to the top of our icing using mesh. I've gone ahead and just finalized that, basically just by duplicating the sprinkles and then deleting the mesh network, and that saves everything for you. We also added shaders to our donut. In this video, we're going to take a look at just doing a bit of some basic lighting and also how to render and save out your image. So how do we do lighting in Arnold? So to create a light, what you want to come and do is come up to the Arnold tab up here, and this section here is where all your lights are. So there's a few different types. We have a regular area light. If you go ahead and create one of those, I'll just pull that up, you'll see that will be this little square here. This is kind of just like your basic light in Arnold, okay? It's your sort of do-it-all light. This light kind of features basically in any render engine, Blender, with Eevee and Cycles, and whether or not we're using any other kind of render engine in any software, you're always going to have a kind of light like this, and this can function as just essentially like your most basic of lights in real life too. If we come to the attribute editor on the right hand side, you can see we have a whole host of settings, from the color of the light, the intensity, the exposure, color temperature, spread, resolution, samples, soft edges, and all these other things. Also visibility as well, right? So we'll get into what these do in a little bit. There's a few other light types as well, like mesh light, which will essentially, if you were to apply this to a mesh, right, like if I clicked on this donut, well, let's go with the icing, it will essentially just turn that into a light source. You can see it's made it transparent if you want to create some sort of glowing donut, but that's not what we're going to do today. There's a few other types of lights as well, like a photometric light and a sky dome light, which is what we used in the last episode to help us preview our shaders. And we'll go into that again a little bit here. But to begin with, we're going to start by just using an area light. And we're going to set up one of the most simple and effective lighting setups, which is 3-point lighting. Now, if you spent any time in photography or 3D, you've probably heard of a 3-point lighting setup. Essentially, like the name suggests, it's where you have 3 lights, and they all have different names and kind of different purposes. So you might have a key light, okay, a fill light, and a backlight. So to kind of demonstrate this, let's just start creating a 3-point lighting setup, and we'll see why it works, what it's good for. So we'll place this first light off over here. Maybe we'll rotate it a little bit to point towards our donut. Okay, and we'll come up to render, and we'll just press on Arnold. And that will start rendering. And by default, you're not going to see anything. Okay, it's just going to be black. Unless I move this light really, really close to the donut, but even then, you can see we're barely getting any light whatsoever. It's because when you create a light, you can see the intensity is set to 1, the exposure to 0, and essentially, it's not really giving out much light at all. So to actually increase the brightness of the light, we could just go ahead and increase the intensity. If I whack this up to like 10 here, you can see it's still not doing a whole lot though, right? It illuminates our donut a little bit brighter than it did before, but it's still not doing much. What you actually want to adjust is the exposure. And the reason for that is because adjusting the exposure kind of works a bit more like how a light works in real life. It works in terms of more like photographic stops, right? So each one that we increase doubles the light output. So if I was to put the exposure to 1, that's actually doubling the output of the light, okay? If I was to increase this to 10, you can see now we're getting a much, much brighter light than we did just with the intensity slider alone, okay? In simple terms, you can make your light. In simple terms, you can make your light much brighter without adding, insane values like 100 in the intensity. You can use lower values. So if we increase this to something like 15 and just pull this back, it might be a tad bit too bright. Maybe let's go for like 13 or something like that. You can see it's illuminating our donut quite nicely, even from this far away. But we are still getting some dark spots. But in a 3-point lighting setup, this is what is known as the key light. The primary purpose of this light is it's the main light source of your light setup. It's going to be the most intense, and it's direct, right? So you can see how we have it pointing directly at the donut. And it's, it's ideally going to be illuminating your subject, like whether that's an actor or, in our case, a big donut. The second light source, we'll just go ahead and duplicate this one with Control-D and move this to the other side. Okay, point that at the donut. That's known as the fill light. So this is more used just to cancel out the shadows created by the key light. It's not really meant to create its own shadows. It's less powerful than the key light, and we place it opposite to the key light. So we'll go ahead and bump down the exposure on this Maybe we'll reduce that to something like 10. We can always play with the values afterwards. Okay. And you imagine that your camera is going to be somewhere between these two lights. So we would assume the camera is somewhere in here. Okay. And the final light that you want to create is what's called a backlight, a hair light, or a rim light. Essentially just because it goes behind your donut. We'll just turn off the render for the time being so we can see where all the lights are placed. So this is where the idea of the 3 points comes from, right? So you have the fill light, or the fill light shooting this way, the key light shooting this way, and then the rim light or the backlight literally behind your subject, right? So this is also typically placed a bit higher than your subject, so we might put it up here. And you can make the color quite bright, but you can also feel free to adjust this however you like. We'll go ahead and re-render again there. And you can see now what happens is if I look at the donut from this angle, we're getting our main light source from the left-hand side, right, with the key light. We're getting a little bit of light from the right-hand side from the fill light, just to make those shadows less intense. And you see how we have this quite bright highlight on the top? That's coming from our rim light, and that's where it kind of gets the name, because it just highlights the back rim of your donut. It's also called a hair light sometimes when working with people, because, you know, it just illuminates some of that hair. And this is why you place it above, because we're getting that rim lighting on the top of the donut. If I was to place it way down here, you can see we're not really getting a whole lot, just slight little bits on the edge. But you kind of want it a bit higher than your subject. So we're getting this nice background light. And one of its main purposes is to separate our donut from the background. Right? If I was to hide that, you can see how our donut just blends into the black here. But when we turn that back on, it really pops out from the background, doesn't it? So that's the main purpose of the rim light. So that is your basic light setup. Okay? And now that we have that in place, what can we do to make our render a little bit more interesting? So what I like to do is I've grouped everything together and I've just called that donut, call it whatever you like. And let's create a camera to frame our subject. So we're going to come up to create camera and then camera. There we go. And we're just going to pull that back. Okay. If you press space on your keyboard, or you can press this button over here to come to the same view. And then go to, in whatever other view you want to change your camera to. I typically like to use this one here. Go to view and then cycle through camera. That will then switch the view to your newly created camera. Okay, so if you can see if I move this around now, you can see the view here changing as we move our camera. Okay, you can also just move the camera like you would the perspective camera. If we come into here, right now I'm just holding down Alt and middle mouse to pan around. We can zoom out and orbit as well. You can also adjust the settings like you would with a cube from here. If I was to change the rotate, that also works. One of the best practices to do though when you're using a camera and you're rendering is you actually want to turn on something called the resolution gate. I'm just going to press this button up here and you can see how it's added these white blocks or gates on the either side. Essentially what this is doing is it's showing you the framing of the camera and the final output of the camera. So this kind of 16:9 aspect ratio that we have in this window isn't what the final output of the render is going to be. Turning on the resolution gate shows you actually what the camera is going to be seeing and what we'll be able to save out as an image once we render. So let's go ahead and position our camera. You can do that either by moving it in this viewport here. I like to do it from the actual camera itself, so I'm just going to press space on here. And we'll look at it kind of straight on, like so. Let's also change the position of our donut, because right now this is a bit boring. So you kind of want to be thinking kind of about composition, right? Like, let's say you were making an advertisement and you wanted to display this donut. Would you necessarily just display it exactly from the side like this? Probably not, right? You might be looking at it down a little bit like this so you can see more of the overall shape. But maybe we could do something a little bit more fun and we can actually rotate the donut a little bit, right? Maybe we have it at an angle like this so it just looks a little bit more dynamic. Make sure that we can see a good amount at the bottom, but also the icing on top. You could, you know, rotate it around a little bit. Maybe you have some drip somewhere that you'd rather be a bit more of a focal point. I'm going to keep it like this, but you can see how already just changing the angle of the donut makes it look like a slightly more interesting composition. Okay. Now if we go ahead and render this from this view, you can see that our lights are still working, but we might need to change the position of a few different things. So one thing that I would like to do while I'm like setting up a lighting setup is I'll just press space and we can keep this render going in this view down here. Okay, you can even resize this window if you want to. And then while this is rendering, we can still just move the lights around freely in the viewport here, in the perspective viewport. So I might bring this light a bit closer over to this side to get us some highlights here on the left-hand side with our key light. And then what I might do is bring our rim light a bit closer. And now that we've changed the position of the donut, it might be a bit too high. Maybe we'll bring that down slightly. Okay. And we could change the positions of some of these lights a little bit. Or we don't want it to be as bright on the right-hand side, just to have some contrast. Okay, and you can see already we've got a relatively interesting lighting setup. It's not just plain and boring. And, you know, we could increase the intensity of this rim light. If we wanted that highlight to be really, really strong, maybe we could whack that up to like 15 or something. But you just want to watch out for things getting blown out, which is essentially just when it's so bright, things just become white and you can't see them properly anymore. But I quite like this. I think this is looking quite nice. I did mention that we could use HDRI, we could use a sky dome light, and while we could do that, they generally provide sort of less control over the exact lighting setup, particularly when you're doing more like subject or product photography setups, kind of like this. Just because they're illuminating more naturally like you're in an exterior space. They're great if you're doing reflective things like a metal and you need some sort of reflections, right? But for something like this, it's not really necessary, and we're going to get a lot more control just over having our own lights like this that we can move around and, you know, change like to whatever kind of setup that we'd like, right? Instead of just having a one big overall light, which acts more like a sun or a room or something. We could adjust some of these settings as well to your heart's desire, basically just for however you want this to be. We could reduce the fill light to make this a bit more moody. Or we can just keep it as it is to keep it nice and bright. You could make it real kind of like old school cinema, if like maybe we massively bump up the rim light exposure, but then reduce the exposure of the key light. It's quite like a dramatic, spacey looking shot of the donut, but it's really kind of up to you. I'm going to keep mine kind of like this. A good thing to do as well is to rename your lights to exactly what they are. So I'll just go ahead and rename this. So this will be the rim light. And then we've got the fill light over this side. And the key light as well, just so you can keep track of those things. And that's just a good way to keep things tidy, and you're seeing always name things, otherwise you're going to end up having a bunch of p-keep ones and stuff like that. Okay, so now that we have the lighting set up the way we want, there's a few settings we can change just to speed things up. So when you create a light, by default, the max number of bounces is going to be 999. This is kind of just how many times the light rays coming out of the light are going to bounce around on a subject, or in 3D space, right? Like, if you imagine how light works in real life, the light rays hit things and bounce off of them, and they gradually get absorbed depending on the material properties. This is way too high for what we need, and you won't be able to notice the difference, so I typically like to decrease this down to something like 10, and that is just going to improve the speed of our render times quite a lot. Not that it takes too much time to render to begin with. Let's just pause the render for the time being. The next thing we can do is take a look at the actual render settings. We're going to come up to this little cog and box up here. And under common, there's a few things that we can look at, like the renderable camera. I've just got that set to render cam, which is the one that we created already. You could select the perspective camera as well, but typically you want to set that to whichever camera you're going to be rendering from. The image size as well, there's a bunch of different presets in here. I currently have it at a 2000 by 2000 grid. You could scroll down and do HD 1080. You can see how our resolution gate has changed there, so maybe we'll go with that. And that gives you an idea of what you're going to be able to see in your final image. So I'll just zoom in a little bit. The next thing to take a look at is under Arnold Renderer. We've got a whole bunch of different settings here, right? Like the camera AA, the diffuse, the specular. Essentially, this is how many samples the render engine is going to be using to create the image. I think the default camera AA is free, and that should generally work well for most applications. With the modern version of Arnold, it has a built-in denoiser under images down here. Images, sorry. So a camera AA of 3 should be good. Ideally, you want to keep this as low as possible, but the defaults are a great starting point. I wouldn't really go any lower than 2 for the diffuse, right? So the samples here on diffuse and specular, as the name might suggest, 2 is how many samples are going to be used to render diffuse. Diffuse just being the color of your image, so if you think like the pinks and blues of the sprinkles, that's a diffuse. The specular, how shiny it is, so you can see it reflecting a little bit there off of the material. Transmission as well is how translucent, or the translucency properties, translucency samples. It's not really necessary for this since our donut isn't translucent. Otherwise, it would not really be a very good donut. And then subsurface scattering and volume indirect. We don't need to worry about that today. So these are just decent settings to have to begin with, and we'll just leave it at that. So how do we actually go ahead and render this and save out an image? So we're going to come up in the Arnold tab. We're going to press on this button here with this eye and make sure that your render cam is selected up here. Okay, so I'm going to change that to render cam shape. And then we're just going to press the play button up here. Sometimes it will select the wrong camera to begin with, so you might need to change that. Okay, there's a bit of a bug sometimes, so it thinks the shape, the camera we created, even though it's called render cam, is camera shape 1, so we're just going to select that one from here. Okay, and you can see that rendered in about 7 seconds with those settings. And that really didn't take much time at all, right? It's quite quick. Your mileage may vary. I have a reasonably powerful computer. One thing to make sure you do before you render as well is make sure you have smooth previewed everything, just to keep that nice and round. We don't want to see any sort of hard edges, unless it's the style we're going for. We don't need to do the same for the sprinkles. They're so small that you won't really be able to tell anyway. So yeah, that is how you render your image. If you want to save it, just come up to File and then go to Save Image. Okay, and then you can name that whatever you want. Maybe we could call that donut.png, something like that. Hit Save. Then if I just navigate to where that was, we now have our donut render. Okay, and that saves with a transparent background as well. So yeah, that's been a brief intro to Maya while creating a donut. Obviously everyone knows the famous Blender donut tutorial. I thought it'd just be fun to do a little bit of a tutorial version of it in Maya, since some people had requested it and we made a donut recently just for a short video, just for fun. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and got something out of it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. We'll happily answer basically any question at all, unless it's really weird. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.